Imagine a world on the cusp of an unimaginable change. For nearly 2 centuries, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, founded by the great Cyrus, had dominated the ancient world. It was a realm of unparalleled wealth, diverse cultures, and immense power. But across the sea, in the mountainous lands of Macedonia, a different kind of power was quietly brewing, soon to unleash a storm that would shake the very foundations of the known world. Hello, and thank you for joining me on this historical journey. As we settle in for this long story, if you find yourself enjoying our time together, please consider taking just a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps more than you know. And for a little fun, I'd love to see how long you've been listening. So drop a comment below letting me know. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is on their journey. Now, let's begin. To understand the storm that was coming, you first have to understand the sheer size of the world it was about to hit. The Persian Empire wasn't just a country, it was the world, or at least the known world to millions of people. For 200 years, it had stretched from the shores of modern-day Turkey all the way to the mountains of Afghanistan and the rivers of India. Imagine a map in your mind, and just shade in a massive portion of it. That was Persia. It was an empire of 100 different peoples, 100 different languages and gods, all living under the rule of one man, the King of Kings. In our story, that man is Darius III. When Darius sat on his throne in the grand cities of Susa or Persepolis, he wasn't just a king. He was the inheritor of a legacy of Cyrus the Great, who founded the empire, of Darius the Great, who organized it, a line of rulers who commanded a power the world had never seen before. The empire was incredibly wealthy. Gold flowed from its mines, grain grew in its fertile valleys, and tribute poured in from every corner of the realm. To manage this vast territory, the Persians created a brilliant system of provinces, or satrapies, each run by a governor who answered directly to the king. A network of royal roads, like ancient highways, connected the empire, allowing messengers and armies to move with shocking speed. From the perspective of anyone living at that time, Persia was forever. It was the natural order of things. Its armies were enormous, drawing soldiers from every province, Scythian archers, Egyptian spearmen, Babylonian cavalry. Who could possibly stand against such a might? Darius, inheriting all of this, had every reason to feel secure. He was the ruler of a stable, powerful, seemingly unbreakable dominion. But across the Aegean Sea, on the very edge of the Greek world, something was changing. Here, in the rugged, mountainous land of Macedonia, a kingdom long seen as backward and on the fringe by the sophisticated city-states of southern Greece, like Athens and Sparta, a revolution had taken place. This was not a world of grand palaces and ancient traditions, but of hardy farmers and fierce warriors. And for years they had been a fractured people, a collection of tribes, until one man changed everything. His name was Philip II, Alexander's father. Philip was a brilliant, ruthless, and ambitious king. He took the divided tribes of Macedonia and forged them into a single, powerful nation. But his true genius was in the military. He took the traditional Greek way of fighting, the phalanx, and perfected it. He armed his soldiers with a new weapon, the sarissa, an enormous spear, nearly 18 feet long. Imagine a wall of men holding these impossibly long spears, marching forward as one unstoppable unit. It was terrifying. It was effective. With this new army, Philip did what no one thought possible. He conquered and united most of Greece under his leadership. But his eyes were set on a much, much bigger prize. He dreamed of leading a united Greek army across the sea to invade the Persian Empire itself. It was an old dream, a dream of revenge for Persia's past invasions of Greece. Philip built the army. He created the dream, but he would never get to see it through. He was assassinated, leaving his throne, his revolutionary army, and his grand, unfinished ambition to his 20-year-old son, Alexander. So the stage was set. You have this ancient, sprawling, wealthy empire. It's a giant, perhaps a little slow, a little complacent, confident in its own size and history. And then you have this small, hungry, aggressive, new power. A kingdom led by a young man who has just inherited the most disciplined and deadly fighting force on the planet, along with his father's obsessive dream of Eastern conquest. This wasn't just going to be another border dispute. It was a confrontation of civilizations, a clash between the established old order and a surging, unpredictable new force. The threads of destiny were beginning to pull these two worlds and these two men toward each other. The quiet whispers of what was to come were growing louder, echoing in the halls of Persepolis and the military camps of Macedonia. The world was about to change forever. Every titan of history begins as a child, shaped by their world, their family, and the lessons they learn. And to truly understand the collision that was coming, you have to understand the very different paths that led these two men to their thrones. Their early lives, though worlds apart, laid the groundwork for the extraordinary leaders they would become. Let's start with Alexander. From the moment he was born, he was treated as something special. His mother, Olympias, was a deeply passionate and mystical woman. She was a princess from a neighboring kingdom, and she believed, and made sure Alexander believed, that he was descended from heroes, not just any heroes. On his father's side, the legendary Heracles, and on her side, the great warrior of the Trojan War, Achilles. She filled his head with stories of greatness, telling him he was destined for more than just the throne of Macedonia. He was destined for godhood. And then there was his teacher. His father, Philip, hired the most famous mind in the entire Greek world to be Alexander's tutor, the philosopher Aristotle. For years, Aristotle taught the young prince everything, not just reading and writing, but philosophy, politics, science, and strategy. He fostered in Alexander an insatiable curiosity about the world. But most importantly, he gave Alexander a copy of Homer's epic poem, the Iliad. Alexander became obsessed with it. He carried that book with him for the rest of his life, even sleeping with it under his pillow. He saw himself in its main character, the fierce, brilliant, and glory-seeking warrior, Achilles. Like Achilles, Alexander burned with a desire to be the best, to be remembered forever. He wasn't just a prince, he was a scholar and a warrior in one. He got his first taste of real battle as a teenager, leading the cavalry for his father at the decisive battle of Chaeronea, where they crushed the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. He had boundless energy, a brilliant mind, and a deep-seated belief that he had a personal destiny to fulfill. Now, contrast that with the man he would one day face, Darius III. Darius's path to the throne was completely different. He was not the direct heir. He was a nobleman, a distant relative of the royal family. But he was not born with the expectation of becoming the king of kings. He earned his position. In the Persian system, which valued ability alongside bloodline, Darius made a name for himself as a capable administrator and a brave soldier. He served as a satrap, a governor of one of Persia's many provinces, learning how to manage the complex machinery of the empire. He earned a reputation for personal courage in a campaign against a rebellious mountain tribe, where he supposedly defeated a champion in single combat. He was respected, he was competent, he was loyal. His rise to the very top came through the dark and dangerous world of Persian court politics. A powerful court official, a eunuch named Bagoas, had poisoned the previous two kings and was looking for a puppet he could control. He chose Darius, but he chose wrong. Once Darius was on the throne, he proved to be his own man, quickly forcing Bagos to drink the same poison he had served to others. Darius wasn't a fiery youth with a divine destiny. He was a seasoned, capable man who had navigated a treacherous system and come out on top. He inherited an immense burden, the duty to protect and maintain the vast ancient empire of his forefathers. He was a guardian of tradition. So, you have these two men, forged in completely different fires. One, Alexander, is the gifted son, tutored by the world's greatest philosopher, told he is a demigod, and handed the world's most lethal army with a pre-made plan for conquest. The other, Darius, is the experienced manager, a man who rose through the ranks based on merit and skill, who now finds himself responsible for holding together the largest empire on earth. One was driven by a new vision, a burning desire to create a legacy. The other was driven by the immense weight of an ancient one. The foundations of their characters were laid, their ambitions set. But a crown, once gained, must be secured. And for both Alexander and Darius, their first tests as kings would come not from each other, but from challenges brewing deep within their own realms. The crown is not merely a symbol of power, it is a heavy burden, one that comes with immediate tests. For both Alexander and Darius, taking the throne meant facing down rivals, crushing rebellions, and proving to a skeptical world that they were worthy. How they handled these first storms would define everything that came after. For Alexander, the challenge came the instant his father, Philip, fell. The news spread like wildfire across Greece. The great Philip was dead. In his place was his son, a boy of 20. In cities like Athens and Thebes, long resentful of Macedonian rule, a spark of hope ignited. This was their chance, they thought, to throw off the shackles of their northern conquerors. They had gravely misjudged their new king. Alexander didn't hesitate. He didn't send envoys. He marched with incredible speed. He moved his veteran army south, appearing before the walls of cities that thought he was still hundreds of miles away, mourning his father. The message was clear. Nothing had changed. But the city of Thebes decided to test him. They rebelled openly, killing the Macedonian soldiers stationed in their city. Alexander's response would echo through history. He offered them a chance to surrender. They refused. So, he unleashed the full might of his army. The city was taken by storm, a brutal, bloody affair. And what came next was designed to be an act of calculated terror. By order of Alexander, the ancient and proud city of Thebes was razed to the ground. Every building was torn down, every temple destroyed. Its thousands of citizens were rounded up and sold into slavery. He sent a message to all of Greece, written in fire and stone. I am not my father. I am something else entirely. I am the new, undisputed leader, and my vision will be realized. After the destruction of Thebes, there were no more rebellions. The Greek states quickly reaffirmed their support for his planned invasion of Persia. They were too terrified not to. Meanwhile, across the sea, Darius was facing his own trials. He had to prove his mettle, not on an open battlefield, but in the shadowy corridors of his own court. Remember, he was placed on the throne by the powerful eunuch, Bagoas, a man who had murdered kings before and expected Darius to be his compliant puppet. Darius had to navigate these treacherous currents with skill and cunning. He knew Bagoas was a threat, and soon enough, the ambitious courtier, seeing that Darius was no one's pawn, decided to remove him the same way he had removed others, with a cup of poison. But Darius was a step ahead. He learned of the plot, and in a dramatic confrontation, he forced Bagoas to drink the very poison he had intended for the king. With that single, ruthless act, Darius cut the strings of the puppet master and secured his own authority within the court. He then turned his attention to the empire itself. A rebellion had been simmering in Egypt. Darius acted decisively, sending forces to crush the uprising and re-establish firm Persian control. He showed the many governors and peoples of his vast realm that he was not a weak king, but a guardian of Persian order, committed to maintaining the stability of the empire. So you have two kings facing similar challenges of descent and legitimacy, but from vastly different positions. Alexander, looking outward, asserting his power with terrifying force. Darius, looking inward, securing his inheritance with strategic cunning. Both had now proven they had the strength and the will to rule. The stage was finally, truly set. The practice was over. With their crowns secured and their initial challenges overcome, the gaze of both Alexander and Darius turned towards the horizon, towards each other. For one, it was the dream of glorious conquest. For the other, the solemn duty of defense. The air itself seemed heavy with anticipation. The great clash was no longer a question of if, but when. The whispers of ambition, given enough time, often turn into the roar of armies. For centuries, the idea of invading Persia had been a distant, almost mythical dream for the Greeks. But in the spring of 334 BCE, that dream became a terrifying reality. Alexander, with his hardened Macedonian army, stood on the shores of Europe, looking across the narrow strait of water known as the Hellespont, towards the vast continent of Asia. This was the ultimate gamble, the boldest move of his young life. He didn't just sail across, he made it a spectacle, a moment for the ages. As his ship approached the Asian shore, he stood at the prow, dressed in full armor. Taking his spear, he hurled it into the soil, claiming the continent for himself by right of conquest. It was a point of no return. He had brought an army of around 40,000 men, a formidable force. Yes, but a tiny fraction of the manpower the Persian Empire could summon. He had limited money. He had cut himself off from home. He was betting everything on his own genius, the discipline of his soldiers, and his unwavering belief in his destiny. On the other side, the local Persian governors, the satraps of Asia Minor, gathered to meet this threat. At first, they were not overly concerned. This was a sideshow, a raid by an arrogant young king. But one man among them knew better. His name was Memnon of Rhodes. He was a Greek, a brilliant mercenary general who served the Persian king. He understood the Macedonians. He knew how they fought, and he knew how dangerous Alexander was. Memnon gave the Persian commanders sound advice. Do not fight him directly, he urged. His army is professional. Yours is a levy. We should retreat, burn the fields, destroy the crops, empty the cities. It's called a scorched earth strategy. Deny his army food and supplies, and they will starve. His invasion will collapse on its own. It was a wise plan. But the Persian satraps were proud nobles. The idea of destroying their own rich lands was an insult. They saw Alexander as a boy, and they wanted the glory of crushing him in battle. They rejected Memnon's advice. It was a fatal mistake. They chose to make their stand at the Granicus River. They lined their cavalry up on the far bank, high ground, waiting for Alexander to attempt a crossing. It seemed like a strong defensive position. Any army trying to climb the muddy banks of the river would be disorganized and vulnerable. Alexander's own commanders, wise old veterans from his father's day, urged him to wait. Cross the river at dawn, they said, when we can surprise them. But Alexander wasn't a man who waited. He saw the Persian line, and he saw his opportunity. He would do the one thing they didn't expect, a direct head-on assault in broad daylight, right into the teeth of their defense. He gave the order to attack. He himself led the charge with his elite companion cavalry, plunging into the river. The water churned with men and horses. Spears flew. The Macedonians struggled up the slippery bank, right into the waiting Persian cavalry. It was chaos. Alexander was in the thick of it, fighting hand to hand. His helmet was battered, his spear shattered. At one point, a Persian nobleman swung a heavy axe at his head. The blow struck his helmet, shearing off part of it and dazing him. As the nobleman raised his weapon for the killing blow, another Macedonian rider swept in at the last possible second, cutting the attacker down. While Alexander fought for his life, his infantry, the unstoppable phalanx, made it across the river. They formed their terrifying wall of 18-foot spears and began to march forward. The Persian lines, already engaged with the cavalry, buckled and then broke. The battle turned into a rout. The victory was total. The Battle of the Granicus was more than just a victory. It was a declaration. Alexander hadn't just crossed into Asia. He had landed a powerful, undeniable blow against the Persian Goliath. The local Persian army was shattered, and their commanders were dead. The world now truly knew his name. The gates to the western part of the Persian Empire now lay open. But this was just one corner of a vast realm. Far to the east, in his grand palaces, Darius III was now hearing the news. This was no mere raid. This was a full-blown invasion led by a commander of shocking skill and audacity. Alexander's path forward would not be easy. And now the great king himself was stirring. How would Darius respond to this challenge? And how would Alexander push deeper into an empire that still had limitless resources and men at its command? With the victory at the Granicus, Alexander wasn't just a conqueror. He began to act like an empire builder. His march through the western part of Persia, the region we call Asia Minor, wasn't just a mad dash for glory. It was a careful, calculated strategy. He was already sowing the seeds of a new world, and the subtle art of long-term vision was taking root. You see, Alexander understood something crucial. The Persian Empire had one massive advantage he couldn't match: a huge, powerful navy that controlled the seas. This navy could sail behind him, cut off his supplies from Greece, and even land troops to attack his rear. It was his single greatest vulnerability. So, what did he do? He decided to defeat the navy without ever fighting it at sea. His plan was brilliant in its simplicity. He marched his army south, down the coast, city by city. His goal was to capture every single port, every harbor, every naval base the Persians had in the Aegean Sea. If their ships had nowhere to dock, nowhere to get supplies or repairs, the navy would become useless. It was a methodical dismantling of Persian power. His reception was mixed. In the ancient Greek cities, along the coast, which had been under Persian rule for generations, many hailed him as a liberator. He would arrive, depose the pro-Persian rulers, and declare the city a democracy. But others resisted fiercely. In the city of Halicarnassus, which had massive walls and was defended by his old adversary, Memnon of Rhodes, Alexander faced a long and difficult siege. It was a brutal, bloody fight that showed him this would not be an easy conquest. But he was relentless. He never gave up. One by one, he took the coastal cities, securing his flank and slowly strangling the life out of the Persian navy. After securing the coast, he turned his army inland and marched to the ancient city of Gordium. And here, he faced a legendary puzzle. In the city's temple was an old chariot, its yoke tied to a pole with an incredibly complex knot. It was made of tough, dry bark, and the ends were hidden deep inside the tangle. An ancient prophecy said that whoever could undo this knot would become the ruler of all Asia. For ages, people had tried. They had picked at it, pulled at it, studied it for hours, all without success. Alexander looked at the knot. He understood the prophecy. He understood the challenge. But he didn't play by the same rules as everyone else. He didn't try to untangle the impossible. He simply drew his sword, and with a single, powerful slice, he cut the Gordian knot in half. His solution, so simple and direct, spoke volumes about his character. He didn't see obstacles. He saw things to be overcome, and he believed his will was stronger than any tradition or puzzle. Far across the empire, in the gilded halls of Babylon and Susa, Darius began to feel the tremors of this relentless advance. The news of the Granicus had been concerning, but the fall of the coastal cities, the slow, methodical conquest of the entire western seaboard, this was something different. The young Macedonian was no mere raider. He was a serious, strategic challenger. This threat would not be handled by local governors. The time for delegating was over. It was time for the great king himself to respond. Darius began to gather his forces, summoning soldiers from every corner of his vast realm. He would assemble a grand army, a force of such overwhelming size that it would simply swallow this impudent Greek invader whole. He would lead it himself. With Asia Minor now largely under his control, Alexander prepared to plunge deeper into the very heartland of the Persian Empire. Darius, for his part, was mobilizing, bringing together a force unlike any the world had ever seen. The two kings were now on a direct collision course. The decisive clash was drawing near, a confrontation that would test the very limits of military genius and imperial might. The two grand armies were finally about to meet. The air grew thick with anticipation as the two greatest powers of the ancient world finally moved towards a direct confrontation. For Alexander, it was the chance to prove his destiny. For Darius, it was the opportunity to crush this audacious invader and reassert the might of Persia. The stage was set near the narrow coastal plain of Issus, where the fate of an empire hung in the balance. Darius had assembled a truly colossal army. You have to picture a sea of humanity flowing out of the heart of the empire. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, by some ancient accounts. Cavalry from the eastern plains, the elite infantry known as the immortals, archers, spearmen, a force designed to crush through sheer weight and numbers. Compared to this, Alexander's army of around 40,000 seemed like a handful of pebbles against a mountain. The sight of the Persian host, with its glittering armor and endless ranks, must have been terrifying. But Darius, confident in his overwhelming numbers, made a fatal mistake. He moved his massive army into a narrow plain, hemmed in by mountains on one side and the sea on the other. In this confined space, he couldn't spread his forces out. He couldn't use his numbers to surround and swallow Alexander's smaller army. In effect, he had trapped his own advantage. It was a battlefield that rewarded discipline, training, and tactical genius over sheer mass. And Alexander, seeing this, knew his moment had come. The battle began. The Macedonian phalanx, that solid wall of 18-foot spears, advanced slowly and unstoppably in the center, grinding against the Persian front line. But the decisive action, as always, was with Alexander himself. He took his elite companion cavalry and, instead of attacking the flank, he identified a weak point in the Persian line and charged directly towards the center. Directly towards where Darius himself stood, observing the battle from his magnificent war chariot. He wasn't directing from the rear, he was the tip of the spear. The charge was ferocious, a thunderous crash of men and horses. They smashed through the Persian line, creating chaos and panic. And for the first time, Darius, the great king, the ruler of the known world, found himself in personal, mortal danger. He saw the wild-eyed Macedonian king, covered in dust and blood, fighting like a madman, getting closer and closer. And in that moment, Darius made a decision that would change history. He panicked. His war chariot got stuck in the mud. He abandoned it, leaped onto a horse, and fled the battlefield, riding for his life. The sight of the great king himself, the symbol of the empire, turning and running, sent a shockwave through his army. The command structure collapsed. The battle turned into a massacre. What began as a clash of armies became a desperate rout, culminating in the unimaginable sight of the King of Kings fleeing for his safety, leaving his army, his honor, and his most cherished possessions in the hands of the victor. The victory at Issus was more than a military triumph. It was a psychological earthquake. Alexander had not just beaten the Persian army, he had personally routed its king. And in the abandoned royal camp, his soldiers found a treasure beyond imagining. But more valuable than the gold and jewels was what else they found. Darius's mother, his wife, and his children. These weren't just captives, they were the living symbols of the Persian throne. The news sent a surge of morale through the Macedonian camp and a tremor of disbelief across the Persian Empire. The victory at Issus opened a new, complex chapter in Alexander's campaign. With the great king in flight and his family in captivity, Alexander faced a choice: ruthless conquest or a display of unexpected mercy. In the silent aftermath of the battle, as he stood in the captured tent of his enemy, he held the fate of an empire and its heart in his hands. In the wake of his stunning victory at Issus, Alexander held the fate of Darius's royal family in his hands. The ancient world was not a kind place. Royal captives were often paraded in chains, humiliated, or quietly killed to remove any future threat. This is what Darius's mother, Sisygambis, expected. When Alexander entered her tent, she was terrified. But instead of cruelty, Alexander displayed an astonishing benevolence. He assured her, and Darius's wife and children, that they would not be harmed. He promised that they would be treated with the respect and dignity befitting their royal status, that their life would continue as it had before, only now under his protection. This act, far from being simple compassion, was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. It was brilliant propaganda. By showing such mercy, he was sending a message to the entire Persian Empire. He was not a barbarian destroyer. He was a civilized, honorable man, a worthy king. He was subtly presenting himself as a better, more respectable ruler than their own king, who had abandoned them on the battlefield. With this powerful statement made, Alexander's gaze now turned not east in pursuit of the fleeing Darius, but south. Why? He still had a job to finish. He understood that to truly defeat Persia, he must first complete his mission of controlling the sea. He marched his army down the coast towards the great Phoenician port city of Tyre. Tyre was a fortress on an island, and it refused to surrender. Alexander was faced with a seemingly impossible task. So he did something no one could have imagined. He ordered his men to build a causeway, a land bridge, a full half-mile through the open sea to reach the city walls. The siege of Tyre took 7 months of brutal fighting and incredible engineering. But in the end, Alexander's will prevailed. He had secured the coast. With the Persian navy neutralized, the path to Egypt was open. And here, he was not met with resistance. The Egyptians had long resented Persian rule. They welcomed Alexander, not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. They crowned him pharaoh. He made a long, difficult journey into the desert to visit the famed oracle of the god Ammon at the Siwa oasis. We don't know exactly what the oracle told him in private, but when he emerged, it was widely believed he had been recognized as the son of the god himself. Before leaving Egypt, he chose a spot on the coast, a perfect location for a new port. He traced out the plans for a new city, one that would bear his name for all time: Alexandria. This act showed he wasn't just thinking of conquest. He was thinking of legacy, of trade, of a future that blended Greek and Eastern cultures. In Egypt, Alexander was hailed as a liberator, a pharaoh, and even a god. This period solidified his image as a world-changing figure, preparing him for the ultimate, final confrontation with the man who still called himself the King of Kings, far to the east. In the heart of what remained of his empire, Darius III was not idle. He was a king who had been humiliated twice on the battlefield, a ruler whose lands were being stripped away piece by piece. But he was not yet defeated. From the plains of Mesopotamia, he sent out a call, gathering an army of a size the world had rarely seen, pulling soldiers from every corner of his vast domain. This would not be a repeat of Issus. Darius learned from his mistakes. There, he was trapped in a narrow pass where his numbers meant nothing. This time, he would choose the battlefield. He found a wide, flat plain near a village called Gaugamela. It was perfect. Here, his overwhelming numbers in cavalry could finally be brought to bear. He even had his men level the ground, clearing away any rocks or bushes that might interfere with his masterstroke, the scythed chariots. Imagine these war machines, heavy wooden chariots with long, sharp blades, like sickles, extending from the wheels. Their purpose was simple and brutal: to drive straight into the Macedonian phalanx and slice it to ribbons, creating chaos and panic. Alongside them, Darius had gathered the best horsemen from the East Bactrians, Scythians, Indians, a thundering sea of cavalry. And for the first time, Alexander would face war elephants, 15 of them, brought from India to instill terror in the Macedonian ranks. Reports put Darius's army at 250,000 men, maybe more. It was a force designed not just to win, but to annihilate. While Darius drilled his massive host, Alexander was on the move. He led his army out of Egypt, marching back through Phoenicia and Syria, crossing the great rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, unopposed. His scouts rode ahead, and the reports they brought back were chilling. They spoke of a plain teeming with soldiers, stretching as far as the eye could see. They described the scythed chariots and the elephants. When Alexander shared this intelligence with his generals, you could feel the unease ripple through the camp. His most trusted commander, the old and cautious Parmenion, was deeply worried. He saw the sheer, overwhelming numbers and urged caution. But Alexander, he seemed energized by the challenge. For him, this was the moment he had been working towards his entire life. This wasn't a problem, it was the final test. This was his destiny. He marched his army to within sight of the Persian force at Gaugamela. As night fell, his soldiers climbed a small rise and looked out across the plain. What they saw must have stolen the breath from their lungs. An endless ocean of campfires flickered in the darkness, stretching for miles in every direction. Each light represented a group of enemy soldiers. There were so many fires that they looked like a new field of stars fallen to earth. The low murmur of the vast Persian army, the sound of 100 different languages, carried on the night wind. Fear, a cold and creeping thing, began to settle in the hearts of the Macedonian soldiers. They were less than 50,000 against. That Parmenion went to Alexander's tent. He was grave. "King," he said, his voice low, "the enemy is too many. We cannot face them in the light of day. We must attack now, under the cover of darkness. We can use the confusion to our advantage, create panic, and strike them before they know what is happening." It was a logical plan, a sensible plan. Alexander listened patiently. He looked out at the sea of enemy lights, then back at his old general. He smiled, a calm and confident expression that seemed almost insane given the circumstances. He placed a hand on Parmenion's shoulder. "Your plan is clever, old friend. It is the plan of a thief who hopes to get away with something in the night." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet tent. "But I will not steal my victory." He sent Parmenion to get some rest, assuring him that a well-rested army would win the day. As the old general left, Alexander stood alone, the lamplight casting long shadows across his tent. He knew what he was doing. Attacking at night was a gamble, a thing of chance. He was not a gambler. He was a strategist, and he knew that to truly break the Persian Empire, he had to break its army in the clear light of day for all the world to see. He had to prove, without a doubt, that his way of war, his men, and he himself were superior. His victory had to be absolute. He also knew his opponent. Darius, humiliated but not defeated, had faced the greatest challenge of his reign. After the disaster at Issus, he had fled east, leaving his own mother, wife, and children in Alexander's hands. Alexander had treated them with the respect due to royalty, a calculated act of both chivalry and psychological warfare. He had even sent offers of peace to Darius. He would return the royal family unharmed and recognize Darius as the ruler of all lands east of the Euphrates River. In essence, he offered to split the known world. For many kings, this would have been a generous, face-saving offer. But Darius was the great king, the king of kings, ruler of an empire that had stood for centuries. He could not accept being a partner to this young Macedonian upstart. His reply was one of defiance. He refused the offer. He would fight. From the far reaches of his empire, Darius summoned every available man, every resource. This was not just an army. It was the entire might of Persia, gathered for one final, desperate throw of the dice against the relentless Macedonian. He gathered horsemen from the wind-swept plains of Bactria and Sogdia, fearsome Scythian archers whose ancestors had fought the Greeks for generations. He brought infantry from India, and for the first time, Alexander's men would face the terrifying spectacle of war elephants. And he had his new secret weapon, hundreds of scythed chariots. He had learned from Issus. There, the narrow terrain had choked his army, making his superior numbers useless. This time, there would be no narrow coastal plain, no strategic blunders. This time, he would choose the ground. He found the perfect place, a wide, flat, sweeping plain near a village called Gaugamela. It was an enormous, natural stage for a battle of titans. Here, there were no mountains or narrow passes to restrict him. He could deploy his entire army, stretching for miles, and use his greatest advantage, his overwhelming numbers in cavalry, to sweep around Alexander's flanks and swallow his small army whole. To ensure his chariots would be unstoppable, he ordered his soldiers to work for weeks, clearing and leveling the ground, removing every rock, every bush, every small hill that could possibly disrupt their charge. He was literally reshaping the earth to suit his plan. As Darius meticulously prepared this field of destiny, Alexander was marching. He led his army out of Egypt, across the deserts of Syria, and over the great rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris. His march was a message in itself. I am coming for the heart of your empire, and you cannot stop me. His scouts, the eyes of his army, rode far ahead, gathering intelligence. They brought back reports that confirmed the rumors. The scale of the Persian army was difficult to even comprehend. They described the leveled plain, the scythed chariots poised for attack, the elephants waiting like living siege towers. Alexander listened to these reports, not with fear, but with intense focus. He understood the challenge. He mapped the terrain in his mind, absorbed every detail of Darius's preparations. He knew Darius wasn't just waiting for him. He was luring him into a perfectly prepared trap. This would not be a battle of brute force alone. It would be a battle of wits, of nerve, of strategy. The great king was not playing small. This would be the true test, a battle of unprecedented scale that would decide the fate of two worlds. The stage was meticulously set, the armies amassed, and the fate of empires hung in the balance. As night fell over the vast plains of Gaugamela, both kings surely contemplated the dawn, knowing it would bring the most consequential battle in ancient history. What strategies would be unleashed, and who would emerge victorious from this ultimate clash? The plans were laid, the speeches were ready, and tens of thousands of men tried to find sleep, knowing that for many this would be their last sunrise. The dawn of October 1st, 331 BCE, broke over Gaugamela, illuminating an assembly of military might the world had never witnessed. On this vast plain, two titans stood ready. Alexander, driven by destiny; Darius, defending his ancient empire. The ground trembled with the anticipation of a battle that would echo through millennia. As the sun climbed higher, you could see the two armies in all their terrible glory. Darius stretched his line across the entire plain, a living wall of men and steel that seemed to go on forever. His strategy was simple and powerful: to use his immense numbers to wrap around Alexander's small army, to envelop it and crush it from all sides. In front of this massive wall, he placed his deadliest weapons, the scythed chariots and the towering war elephants, meant to break the Macedonian phalanx and sow terror. Alexander, looking across at this sea of soldiers, knew he could not fight a conventional battle. He would be swallowed whole. So, he did something strange. He arranged his army not in a flat line, but in an angled formation, with his flanks pulled back, almost like a box. He had reserves hidden behind his main line, ready to react to any threat. And then, as the battle began, he did something even stranger. He didn't charge forward. Instead, he began to march his entire army to the right. He moved sideways, parallel to the Persian line. It was a bizarre, unexpected move that confused the Persian commanders. Darius watched this strange, sideways march, growing anxious. He worried Alexander was trying to move off the specially cleared ground he had prepared for his chariots. Or worse, that he was trying to get around the end of his impossibly long line to stop him. Darius had no choice but to order his own cavalry on the left flank to ride out and match Alexander's movement, to try and get ahead of him and circle around. And that was the trap. As the Persian cavalry galloped out to the side, stretching their own line thinner and thinner, a gap began to open. A weakness appeared in the Persian front, right near the center, where Darius himself commanded his royal guard. It was the moment Alexander had been waiting for. It was the chink in the colossal armor. He gave the signal. In an instant, Alexander wheeled his elite companion cavalry, forming them into a sharp wedge, with himself at the very point, and then he charged. Not at the front line, but diagonally, straight into the gap he had just created. It was a maneuver of breathtaking audacity and perfect timing. As the dust of battle swirled, Alexander pierced the very heart of the Persian line, aiming for one man and one man only, the great king himself. While Alexander led his thunderous charge, the rest of the battlefield was chaos. The Persian scythed chariots charged the Macedonian phalanx, but Alexander had trained his men for this. The infantrymen stood their ground, and at the last second, they opened lanes in their formation. The chariots, unable to steer, drove harmlessly through the gaps, where soldiers waiting on the sides speared the drivers and horses. On Alexander's left flank, his old general Parmenion was in desperate trouble, facing the bulk of the Persian cavalry, fighting for his life against overwhelming odds, but all eyes were on the center. Alexander and his cavalry wedge smashed through the Persian guard. Through the chaos, the dust, and the blood, Darius saw him coming. He saw the young, determined face of the Macedonian king, his spear ready, carving a path directly towards his royal chariot. For the second time in his life, facing this same man, Darius's nerve broke. He saw certain death or capture approaching. He spun his chariot around and fled. The moment the king ran, the will of the army broke with him. The royal standard, which showed the army where their king was, disappeared from sight. The soldiers in the center, seeing their leader abandon them, lost all heart. Their flight triggered a panic that spread like wildfire along the vast Persian line. The meticulously planned defense crumbled into a frantic, disorganized rout. Alexander was faced with a choice. He could pursue the fleeing Darius and end the war right there. Or he could turn back and help his embattled left flank under Parmenion, which was on the verge of collapse. He made the difficult choice. He let Darius go and rode to the rescue of his men. Gaugamela was not just a victory, it was the decisive, shattering blow against the Achaemenid Empire. The plain of Gaugamela now lay silent, scarred by the epic clash. Alexander stood as the undisputed master of the battlefield, but Darius still lived, a ghost of his former power. What would be Alexander's next move after this monumental triumph? And what grim fate awaited the last great king of Persia? We follow the immediate aftermath in our next chapter. With the Persian field army shattered and Darius in flight, the path to the ancient capitals of the empire lay open. Alexander, the audacious conqueror, was now poised to claim the immense wealth and symbolic heart of the Achaemenid realm, a transition that would mark a significant shift in his reign. His first target was the legendary city of Babylon. As his army approached, they didn't prepare for a siege. The governor of Babylon, a Persian nobleman named Macedonian, who had actually fought bravely against Alexander at Gaugamela, rode out to meet him, but he didn't come to fight. He came to surrender the city, its fortress, and its treasury. Imagine the scene as Alexander entered Babylon. This wasn't a conquered city, sullen and resentful. The streets were lined with cheering crowds, priests burned incense, and people threw flowers in his path. For the Babylonians, who had long chafed under Persian rule, Alexander was not an oppressor, but a deliverer. He played the part perfectly. One of his first acts was to order the restoration of the great temple of Marduk, the city's chief god, which the Persians had neglected. He made sacrifices to their gods and showed profound respect for their ancient culture. This was a masterclass in winning hearts and minds. He also found a staggering amount of treasure, but the real prize was the city itself, a willing and powerful new base in the heart of his growing empire. His respectful gestures marked a significant shift, suggesting a desire to rule, not merely to destroy. After a month of rest and celebration in Babylon, Alexander marched his army east towards another of the great Persian capitals, Susa. Like Babylon, Susa surrendered without a fight, and here the wealth he discovered was even more staggering. In the royal treasury, his men found nearly 50,000 talents of silver, an amount so vast it's almost impossible to calculate in modern terms. Think of it as hundreds of billions of dollars today. This was the accumulated wealth of the Persian kings, tribute collected for over 2 centuries from all corners of their vast domain. There were golden thrones, priceless jewels, and lavish furniture. Susa, with its golden halls and vast treasuries, became the next prize, a symbol of the immense power Alexander was now inheriting. As Alexander sat upon the thrones of Babylon and Susa, something began to change. He was no longer just the king of Macedon, or the leader of the Greek crusade against Persia. He was becoming something else. He was the master of a vast, multicultural empire, and he seemed to understand that he couldn't rule it by sword alone. He began a new policy, one that would cause tension with his own men for years to come. He started to use Persians in his administration. He left Macedonian, the Persian noble who had surrendered Babylon, in charge as its governor. While a Macedonian general controlled the army, a Persian ran the city. This was a pragmatic choice. He was using the existing, efficient Persian system of government to run his new empire. He was starting to integrate, not just replace. He was becoming the king of Asia. But two major pieces were still missing from his victory. The first was the ceremonial heart of the empire, the magnificent city of Persepolis, built to awe the world with Persian power. And the second was Darius. The great king who had twice fled the battlefield was still alive, still free, somewhere in the vast eastern provinces. As long as he lived, he remained a symbol of resistance, a potential rallying point for anyone who opposed Alexander's rule. With the symbolic heartlands of Persia now in his grasp, Alexander's focus would soon turn to the grandest capital of all, Persepolis. But what fate awaited Darius, the ghost king on the run? The story of his final, desperate moments. And the ultimate end of the Achaemenid dynasty was a drama that had yet to play out. Beyond the administrative and economic centers lay Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid Empire. This was not merely a city, it was a sacred ground, built by generations of great kings, a testament to Persian might and glory. For Alexander, it was the ultimate symbol to claim, and a decision made here would forever cast a shadow on his legacy. The march from Susa to Persepolis was not easy. The path led through rugged mountains, home to fierce tribes who had never truly bowed to the Persian kings. Alexander had to fight his way through a narrow pass known as the Persian Gates. Here, a small but determined Persian force made a heroic last stand, holding back the entire Macedonian army for a month. It was a bloody, difficult fight, but in the end, Alexander found a way around the pass, and the road to Persepolis was clear. When he and his army finally stood before the city, they must have been in awe. Persepolis sat on a massive stone terrace, looking out over the plains. It was a city of colossal palaces, enormous halls filled with hundreds of columns, and magnificent stone carvings covering every wall. These carvings showed people from every corner of the empire: Ethiopians, Indians, Lydians, Egyptians, all walking in procession, bringing tribute to the great king. It was a stunning display of power and wealth, designed to intimidate and impress anyone who saw it. This was the soul of the Persian Empire. The treasure here was even greater. The personal fortune of the kings, accumulated over 200 years. Gold, silver, priceless art, and royal artifacts were piled high. For Alexander and his men, it was the ultimate prize, a tangible symbol of their complete and total victory. Alexander and his army spent several months in Persepolis, resting and celebrating. They held a great feast in the magnificent palace of Xerxes, the very king who had invaded Greece and burned Athens to the ground a century and a half before. Wine flowed freely. In the midst of the drunken revelry, as torches lit the grand hall, the palace was set on fire. The palace of Persepolis, one of the wonders of the ancient world, was utterly destroyed. But why? Why destroy such a masterpiece? Some ancient writers say it was a planned act of revenge. Alexander, fulfilling his role as the leader of the Greeks, was paying Persia back for the destruction of Athens. Other sources tell a different, more dramatic story. They say it was not a plan, but an impulse. In the heat of the party, a famous Athenian courtesan named Tai, Alexander, young, full of wine and passion, supposedly grabbed a torch and led the way, with his drunken companions following, turning a celebration into a storm of destruction. We will never know for sure if it was cold policy or hot passion, But the flames that engulfed the palace of Persepolis sent a message across the ancient world. The Achaemenid era was over. As the smoke from Persepolis drifted into the night sky, Alexander had secured the material and symbolic heart of the Persian Empire. But Darius still lived, a fugitive king, and the conquest would not be truly complete until his fate was sealed. The smoke was still rising from Persepolis when he heard that Darius was trying to raise a new army in the east. Alexander left the bulk of his army to rest and recover. He took only his best cavalry and a hand-picked group of infantry, and he drove them with incredible speed. Across the rugged plains and mountains of Persia, Alexander pressed on, his ambition driving him forward. There was no rest. They rode day and night, changing horses, barely stopping to eat or drink. Capturing Darius alive would be the ultimate proof of his legitimacy. The chase was relentless, a testament to his unyielding will as he sought to capture the very symbol of the empire he had conquered. He fled from one city to the next, his followers dwindling at every stop. The powerful governors and nobles who had once bowed before him were now looking at this defeated king and making their own calculations. His personal guard was still loyal, but his authority was crumbling. For Darius, every dust cloud on the horizon brought a new wave of fear. Was it Alexander, closing in for the kill? His once loyal followers began to waver, and the seeds of betrayal started to sprout within his inner circle. He was a relative of Darius and the satrap, or governor, of the powerful eastern province of Bactria. Bessus was ambitious and ruthless. He saw a king who had lost 2 major battles, abandoned his family, and was now running for his life. He saw weakness, and he saw an opportunity. Alongside another powerful noble, Bessus began to whisper to the other commanders. They argued that Darius's bad luck was a curse on them all. Following him was a path to destruction. What they planned to do next was the real question. Perhaps they could use Darius as a bargaining chip, trading him to Alexander in exchange for their own power and safety. Or perhaps they could kill him. If they killed him, Alexander could never capture the legitimate king. Loyalty frayed, ambition surged, and the ultimate act of betrayal was set in motion by those sworn to protect their king. The relentless chase reached its agonizing climax. For Darius, the end was tragically near, not by the hand of his great adversary, but by those closest to him. What was the ultimate fate of the last great king of Persia, and how would Alexander react to this devastating turn of events? But destiny, often cruel, had a final, tragic act planned for the last great king. Not at the hand of his conqueror, but by those he trusted. He was the great king. He would not be a pawn in some traitor's game. He refused. He drew his short sword, ready to fight his own men. But he was surrounded, overwhelmed. His own guards seized him. In a desolate spot in the mountains of Persia, the unthinkable occurred. Darius, the king of kings, ruler of the known world, was bound in golden chains of final, mocking tribute to his status. A local Persian, horrified by the act, slipped away and rode hard to find Alexander's column. When Alexander heard the news, he was filled with a cold fury. He was being cheated of his victory, denied the chance to face his rival king with honor. He drove his men even harder into a final, desperate sprint. They rode for hundreds of miles with almost no rest, a brutal push to catch the traitors. Finally, after an exhausting chase, Alexander and his small band of cavalry caught sight of the conspirators' column. Bessus and his men looked back and saw the dust cloud of the approaching Macedonians. They knew they were caught. They couldn't outrun Alexander's elite horsemen, not while dragging a wagon with them. In a moment of pure panicked cruelty, Bessus and his men went to the wagon. They stabbed Darius repeatedly with their spears, then spurred their horses on, abandoning the cart and the dying king by the side of the road. Alexander arrived just minutes later. He found not a captive king, but a tragic, bloody scene. The cart was stopped, the horses gone. Inside lay Darius, covered in blood, barely breathing. The King of Kings was dying alone in the dust. One of Alexander's soldiers, a Macedonian who could speak some Persian, was the first to reach him. He gave the dying king a drink of water. According to the legend, Darius used his last breath to thank him, and to thank Alexander for the honorable treatment of his mother, wife, and children. When Alexander himself reached the wagon and saw his great adversary in this state, his reaction was not one of triumph. It was one of profound anger and sorrow. This was not how it was supposed to end. He had been denied his moment of final, honorable victory. He took off his own royal cloak and laid it over Darius's body. With Darius's last breath, the ancient Persian line of kings, the Achaemenid dynasty that had ruled for over 2 centuries, came to an end. Alexander, the conqueror, ensured that his fallen rival would be treated with the respect he deserved. He ordered Darius's body to be embalmed and sent with full honors back to Persepolis, to be buried in the royal tombs alongside his ancestors, the great kings of old. It was a final act of respect and a brilliant political move. The ghost of the Persian Empire now lay truly to rest. Alexander stood as the undisputed ruler of Asia, but his journey was far from over. With the primary objective achieved, where would Alexander's boundless ambition lead him next? And how would his rule begin to transform in this new, vast dominion? We explore Alexander's new vision for his empire in our next chapter. With Darius gone, Alexander's role shifted dramatically. He was no longer simply the leader of a Greek invasion, but the undisputed king of Asia, inheritor of the vast Persian dominion. This new reality sparked a radical vision in Alexander, a fusion of cultures, a new Hellenistic empire. But this vision would not be without its challenges, especially for his loyal Macedonians. To rule an empire as vast and ancient as Persia, Alexander understood he had to become more than just a Macedonian king. He couldn't govern millions of people from dozens of different cultures as a foreign conqueror forever. So, he began to adapt. He started wearing the elaborate robes of the Persian kings, a mix of Macedonian and Persian styles. He filled his court with Persian nobles alongside his Macedonian companions. He adopted the lavish ceremonies of the Persian court. But one custom caused a deep and bitter rift. It was called proskynesis. For the Persians, this was a normal sign of respect for their king. It involved kneeling and bowing so low that your forehead touched the ground. But for the Greeks and Macedonians, this was an act of worship. It was something you did for a god, and only a god. To do it for a man, even a king, was deeply offensive and wrong. When Alexander tried to introduce it at his court, many of his men were horrified. They saw their king, their friend, who had fought beside them, demanding to be treated like a divine being. It was a step too far. This was all part of Alexander's grand, revolutionary idea. He dared to dream of a world where East and West were not just conquered, but truly united. His ambitious policy of fusion went beyond just court ceremony. He began recruiting tens of thousands of young Persian men into his army, training them to fight in the Macedonian style. He wanted to create a new, blended army, loyal only to him, and he went even further. He began to actively encourage his officers and soldiers to marry Persian women. This policy reached its peak later at a massive event known as the Susa weddings, where Alexander himself and 80% of his top commanders all married noble Persian women in a single grand ceremony. His vision was to create a new, mixed ruling class that would hold his new empire together for generations. But Alexander's progressive vision was met with fierce resistance from his own inner circle. His Macedonian veterans, the men who had followed him from home, who had bled for him at Issus and Gaugamela, were deeply troubled. They had marched thousands of miles to conquer the barbarians, not to become them. They saw their king adopting the soft clothes and strange customs of the enemy. They saw him giving positions of power to Persians they had just defeated. Many of them were now rich beyond their wildest dreams, and all they wanted was to go home to Macedon and enjoy their wealth. Instead, their king was planning to march even further east. This discontent began to bubble over into plots and conspiracies. A trusted commander, Philotas, was accused of hiding a plot against Alexander's life. Whether he was guilty or not, he was executed. And in an act of brutal, paranoid security, Alexander also had Philotas's father, the old, loyal general Parmenion, the man who had urged caution at Gaugamela, killed, even though he was miles away and had no connection to the plot. The trust between Alexander and his oldest friends was beginning to break. The journey through Persia had ended, but a new struggle had begun. A battle of wills within Alexander's own camp, as his ambition stretched beyond the known world. With the Persian Empire now secured, where would the insatiable desire for conquest lead Alexander next? And what further trials awaited him and his increasingly weary army? Our next chapter ventures into the unknown territories of the East. With the Persian heartland secured, Alexander's ambition knew no bounds. His gaze now turned eastward, beyond the familiar territories, into the rugged, untamed lands of Central Asia. This was a journey into the unknown, a relentless push against fierce, independent tribes, far from the comforts of his new capitals. He had to hunt down and punish Bessus, the man who had murdered Darius. But this was more than a mission of revenge. It was a mission of conquest. Beyond the Fertile Crescent lay Bactria and Sogdiana, what is modern-day Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. These were wild, independent regions of soaring mountains and scorched deserts. The people here were not like the Persians. They were fierce warriors who had never been truly conquered. They didn't fight in grand armies on open plains. They fought a new kind of war, a frustrating and deadly guerrilla war. They would strike from hidden mountain passes, attack supply lines, and then melt back into the landscape. For Alexander and his Macedonians, this was a nightmare. Their phalanx, so unbeatable in a pitched battle, was useless here. The resistance was led by a brilliant and charismatic local warlord named Spitamines. He was a master of hit-and-run tactics, and for 2 long, brutal years, he ran circles around the Macedonian army. These were campaigns of brutal attrition, pushing Alexander's army to its absolute breaking point. The men were exhausted, fighting an enemy they couldn't see, in a land that seemed to want to kill them. In these distant lands, Alexander displayed both his tactical brilliance and, at times, a chilling ruthlessness. He learned and he adapted. He broke his army down into smaller, faster-moving columns to hunt down the rebels. He founded new cities, named Alexandria, as military forts to control the territory. But when faced with stubborn resistance, his patience wore thin. He showed that his will to conquer remained absolute, regardless of the cost. Rebellious towns were razed to the ground, their populations treated harshly as a terrifying message to others. It was during this brutal campaign, after capturing a fortress perched on an unshakable rock, that Alexander saw Roxanne. She was the daughter of a local Sogdian nobleman, and by all accounts was exceptionally beautiful. But this was more than just a romance. In the midst of relentless campaigns, Alexander married her. It was a brilliant political move. By taking a Sogdian bride, he was showing the people of this unconquered land that he was not just a foreign invader. He was their king, too. This marriage, both personal and political, was a profound statement of his intent to integrate the diverse peoples of his vast new empire. With Bactria and Sogdiana finally subdued after years of bloody fighting and, with Spitamines, eventually betrayed and killed by his own, Alaz's weary sense of peace settled over the army. They had done it. They had conquered the Persian Empire to its furthest edges. Surely, now, it was time to go home. But Alexander's gaze, unyielding, now turned towards the towering peaks of the Hindu Kush mountains. Beyond them lay the legendary lands of India, a new and even more formidable challenge beckoning from the east. He believed he was nearing the edge of the world. Alexander had conquered an empire stretching further than any before him, but at what cost to himself and his weary army? As he stood on the threshold of India, the true limits of human endurance and ambition would be tested like never before. What wonders and horrors awaited them in the subcontinent? And would his tired Macedonians follow him into yet another unknown? Our next chapter begins the legendary campaign into India. Beyond the eastern reaches of the Persian Empire lay the legendary lands of India, a world of unimaginable wonders, fierce warriors, and mystical rivers. For Alexander, this was the final frontier, the very edge of the known world, a place where his ambition would meet its greatest test yet. After crossing the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush, his army descended into the plains of the Punjab. Here, they entered a world unlike any they had ever known. The air was thick and heavy with moisture. The forests were dense and strange. And soon the sky opened up, and the monsoon rains began a relentless, daily downpour that turned the ground to mud and swelled the rivers into raging torrents. For the Macedonians, who were used to the dry climate of the Mediterranean, this was miserable. Their clothes were always wet, their armor rusted, and their spirits sank lower with each passing day. They were weary, thousands of miles from home, and facing an enemy in a land that felt completely alien. Alexander plunged into India, making alliances with some local kings and fighting others. But one ruler stood in his way, a giant of a man named Porus, king of the Pauravas. Porus was determined to defend his kingdom. He gathered his army on the far bank of the Hydaspes River, and at the heart of his force was a weapon that struck terror into the Macedonians. 200 war elephants, armored and ready for battle. For weeks, the two armies faced each other across the wide, churning river. A direct crossing was suicide. Porus watched Alexander's every move. Alexander, in a stroke of genius, began to deceive him. Night after night, he would send troops noisily up and down his side of the river. making it seem like he was preparing to cross. At first, Porus would rush his elephants and men to oppose them, but after many false alarms, he grew complacent. Then, one night, under the cover of a furious thunderstorm, Alexander made his real move. He took his best troops on a long march, miles upstream, and crossed the river at an unguarded spot. When the sun rose, Porus was horrified to see Alexander's army already on his side of the river. The battle that followed was one of the most difficult and bloody of Alexander's entire career. At the Hydaspes, Alexander faced his fiercest opponent yet. The ground shook with the charge of the elephants. They crashed into the Macedonian phalanx, grabbing soldiers with their trunks, goring them with their tusks, and trampling them underfoot. For a moment, the unbreakable Macedonian lines wavered. The fighting was desperate, chaotic, and terrifying, but through sheer discipline, courage, and Alexander's brilliant use of his cavalry to attack the elephants from the sides and rear, the Macedonians eventually gained the upper hand. The victory was total, but it came at a heavy cost. Porus himself fought like a lion until the very end. Wounded and surrounded, he was finally captured. When the defeated king was brought before him, Alexander was struck by his courage and dignified bearing. He asked Porus how he wished to be treated. Porus, looking his conqueror in the eye, gave the famous reply, "Treat me, Alexander, like a king." Alexander was so impressed that he did exactly that. Even in victory, he recognized greatness. He not only gave Porus back his kingdom, but also added more territory to it, making him a powerful and loyal ally. It was a sign of the deep respect Alexander held for his brave opponent. But Alexander's relentless eastward drive was nearing its breaking point. His army, exhausted and longing for home, was about to make a momentous decision that would define the limits of his boundless ambition. The journey's end was closer than he knew. Boundless ambition often collides with the harsh realities of human endurance. Through countless battles and unimaginable hardships, but at the Hyphasis River, the last great river of the Punjab, their unwavering loyalty finally reached its breaking point. The conqueror faced his most unexpected adversary, his own men. After the brutal battle against Porus, Alexander wanted to push on. He had heard tales of another great river, the Ganges, and of the powerful kingdoms that lay beyond it. For him, this was the final step, the path to the great ocean that he believed encircled the world. But his men saw it differently. They had been away from home for 8 long years. They had marched over 17,000 miles. Their bodies were covered in scars, their boots were torn, and their spirits were battered by the endless fighting and the relentless monsoon rains. They had conquered an empire, but at what cost? The men yearned for home, for family, for a life beyond the constant march and endless battles. The spirit of conquest was finally being overshadowed by the longing for peace. Sensing the mood, Alexander gathered his officers. He gave one of the most passionate speeches of his life. He spoke of glory, of their shared destiny, of the riches and fame that awaited them at the edge of the world. He finished, expecting the usual roar of approval, the clash of spears on shields. But this time, there was only silence, a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Then, an old and respected general named Coenus, a man who had fought bravely in every major battle, stepped forward to speak for the army. He spoke respectfully, but his words were firm. He reminded Alexander of the men they had lost, the soldiers who lay buried in Asia. He asked the king to look at the faces of the men who remained, their graying hair, their weary eyes, their scarred bodies. He spoke of their longing to see their parents, their wives, and their children one last time. He ended by saying, "King, it is a noble thing to know when to stop." Alexander, accustomed to unquestioning obedience, found himself facing a united front of dissent. He was furious. He stormed back to his tent, feeling utterly betrayed. For 3 days, he locked himself away, refusing to see anyone, a king in a self-imposed exile. He was hoping the men would change their minds, that they would feel ashamed and come begging to continue. But they did not. They waited. The entire army, the most powerful military force on earth, simply waited. Finally, Alexander had to accept the truth. He could conquer kings and cities, but he could not force his own men to march beyond the limits of their endurance. After days of silent defiance, the indomitable will of Alexander met an immovable force. He performed the religious sacrifices. When the news spread, a roar of joy and relief erupted from the camp. Men wept and embraced each other. They were finally going home. The dream of conquering the entire world was put aside, but the journey home would prove to be as brutal, if not more so, than the conquests themselves. Turning back was not the end of hardship. It was the beginning of a new, agonizing trial. Instead of following a known, safer route back through the mountains, Alexander made a fateful choice. He split his forces. Part of the army would sail back along the coast, charting the unknown waters. He would lead the rest of them on a march overland through the desolate, unforgiving Makran Desert of southern Pakistan. It was a decision that would prove to be one of the costliest blunders of his entire campaign. Why did he do it? No one knows for sure. Perhaps he was driven by his insatiable curiosity, wanting to explore and map this final piece of the empire. Perhaps it was a calculated risk to support his fleet from the land. Whatever the reason, driven by an unknown mix of curiosity, ambition, or perhaps frustration, Alexander led his weary army into the Macron, a vast and unforgiving landscape that would exact a terrible price. The march was 60 days of pure hell. The heat was scorching, reflecting off the endless sand and rock. There were no roads, no trees for shade, and for days on end, no water. Blinding sandstorms would whip up without warning, burying supplies and disorienting the men. The pack animals, unable to cope, began to die by the hundreds, forcing the soldiers to abandon their heavy armor, their tents, and even the loot they had carried for thousands of miles. The Macron became a living nightmare. The army disintegrated into a long, stumbling line of desperate men. The strong would push ahead, trying to reach the next rumored well, while the weak fell behind, left to die of thirst and exhaustion in the blistering sun. Thousands perished, not from battle, but from the brutal, relentless elements. The desert, silent and merciless. But through it all, Alexander endured the same brutal conditions as his men. He walked with them, refusing to ride his horse. He suffered the same thirst, the same hunger, the same burning sun. There is a famous story from this march. Some scouts, having found a tiny bit of muddy water, brought it to him in a helmet, a precious gift for their king. His men watched, their own throats parched, their eyes fixed on him. Alexander looked at the helmet, then looked at the faces of his suffering soldiers. Without a word, he poured the water onto the sand. The message was clear. If there was not enough water for everyone, he would have none either. That single act, according to the historians, was worth more to the army than all the water in the world. Even as his army crumbled around him, his personal resilience served as a powerful testament to his unwavering, if sometimes misguided, leadership. The Macron Desert left an indelible mark on Alexander and his surviving army. They had faced the ultimate test of survival, emerging hardened but irrevocably changed. With the grueling march finally behind them, Alexander's return to the heart of his empire would usher in a new, more complex phase of his rule. One fraught with internal challenges and the echoes of a lost comrade. What awaited him in Babylon? Emerging from the desolate sands of the Macron, Alexander returned to a troubled empire. Years of absence had bred corruption and discontent among his appointed governors, while his own vision of a unified empire increasingly clashed with the expectations of his Macedonian veterans. The final years of his reign would be dominated not by foreign foes, but by internal strife and a growing shadow of paranoia. As he marched back into Persia, reports came flooding in. Many of the satraps, both Persian and Macedonian, that he had left in charge had abused their power. Believing Alexander would never return from the Far East, they had ruled like tyrants, stealing from the treasury and terrorizing the people. Alexander, no longer the distant conqueror, returned as a stern and ruthless ruler. He moved swiftly. One by one, the corrupt governors were arrested, tried, and executed. He cleansed his empire of disloyalty, reminding everyone that even across vast distances, his iron will remain absolute. But the deeper problem was the growing rift between him and his own men. His vision of fusion, once a testament to his progressive mind, now became a source of bitter division. They saw him wearing Persian clothes, surrounded by Persian advisors, and trying to enforce foreign customs. The resentment simmered, and sometimes it exploded. In a horrifying incident, during a drunken argument, Alexander's temper flared. His old friend Cletus the Black, the very man who had saved his life at the Battle of the Granicus, killing him instantly. The moment the deed was done, he was overcome with grief and remorse, locking himself away for days, inconsolable. The act showed how the pressures of command and the constant tension were fraying his mind. Later, at a place called Opis, his army mutinied again when he announced a plan to send the old veterans home and replace them with newly trained Persian soldiers. They felt they were being cast aside. Despite the internal friction, Alexander pressed on with his dream of unity. His grandest statement was the Susa weddings. In a spectacular, week-long festival, he orchestrated the marriage of himself, 80 of his top officers, and 10,000 of his soldiers to noble Persian women. He paid off all his soldiers' debts and gave lavish gifts. For him, it was a powerful, symbolic act, the physical creation of his new, blended ruling class. But for many of his men, it felt like another forced step away from their home and their culture. The strains of prolonged war and the complexities of ruling a vast empire were taking their toll on Alexander. His power was absolute, but his isolation grew. He was the most powerful man in the world, but he seemed increasingly alone, wrestling with his inner demons and the very limits of his own mortality. The final act of his extraordinary life was drawing near. The world had been irrevocably changed by Alexander's conquests, bringing an abrupt and shocking end to a life lived at a pace unmatched in history. His death would plunge his vast empire into immediate turmoil, echoing the very chaos he had sought to conquer. It started after a long night of feasting and drinking. A fever took hold of him, and it would not let go. Day after day, it grew worse. In the ancient city of Babylon, the man who had conquered the world lay dying. His generals, the powerful men who had followed him across the world, gathered outside his tent, their concern turning to despair. They were allowed to file past his bed one last time, a silent, tearful procession of the world's most powerful soldiers paying their last respects to their dying king. They crowded around him, begging him to name a successor. His wife, Roxanne, was pregnant, but there was no son yet to inherit the throne. Who would hold this impossibly vast empire together? His final words are shrouded in mystery, a fitting end for a man who had become a legend in his own lifetime. When asked to whom he left his kingdom, some say he whispered to the strongest, others claim he tried to name a specific general, Crateros, but the word was lost in a dying breath. Whatever he said, it was too ambiguous. He left no clear heir. The relentless pace of his life had finally caught up. In June of 323 BCE, at just 32 years of age, Alexander the Great died. The silence that fell over Babylon was deafening. The golden age of Alexander had ended, and in its wake, chaos was poised to erupt as his generals immediately began to eye each other. Their grief mixed with cold, hard ambition. They were lions circling a kill, ready to tear apart the vast dominion he had forged. The empire Alexander had fought so hard to unite, the one he dreamed would be a fusion of East and West, fractured almost immediately upon his death. His vision of a unified world, though revolutionary, could not withstand the ambitions of his own successors. The wars of the Diadochitha, wars of the successors, erupted, a series of brutal civil wars that lasted for decades. His generals carved up the empire for themselves. Ptolemy took Egypt, founding a dynasty that would last for centuries. Seleucus took the vast eastern territories of Persia and Mesopotamia. The great, unified empire dissolved into a collection of warring Hellenistic kingdoms. And so, the story of Alexander the Great and Darius III comes to a close. 1. The audacious conqueror, whose meteoric rise redefined the ancient world. His legacy is one of unparalleled military genius, the spread of Greek culture across the East, and a vision that was centuries ahead of its time. But it is also a legacy of ruthless ambition, of a growing paranoia that consumed his final years, and of a failure to secure a succession, ensuring his creation would not outlive him. The other, Darius, the guardian of an ancient legacy, the King of Kings, who presided over a magnificent, stable empire that had stood for 200 years. He is often overshadowed, seen only as the man Alexander defeated. But he was a king who tried to defend his home, his traditions, and his people against an unstoppable force, a tragic figure whose empire crumbled around him. Ambition, and the enduring, yet fragile, nature of empire. Their clash echoes through history, reminding us that even in the quiet of the night, the legacies of titans continue to unfold. Thank you for joining us for this incredible journey through one of history's greatest rivalries. We hope this story has been a relaxing and engaging companion for your evening, your drive, or wherever you've been listening. If you enjoyed this long-form story, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps us create more content like this. And let us know in the comments how long you listened, for it's always fascinating to see how far into the night our stories travel with you. As you drift into sleep, ponder the vastness of history's tapestry and join us again for another nighttime history.